The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Prince George walked alongside his mother, Catherine, the Princess of Wales. It was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind where royal duties felt more like a gentle stroll through history than the weight of a crown on young shoulders. George had always been fascinated by the royal guards. Their bright red tunics, towering black bearskin hats, and unwavering dedication to protecting his family made them seem like real-life toy soldiers come to life. Today he was particularly excited because his mother had promised him a closer look at the changing of the guard ceremony. As they approached the main courtyard, George noticed something unusual. One of the guards, standing perfectly still at his post near the main entrance, seemed to be swaying slightly. The young prince had watched enough ceremonies to know that the guards never moved, not even a muscle. They were trained to stand like statues no matter what happened around them. "Mommy, look at that guard," George whispered, tugging gently on his mother's coat sleeve. "Something doesn't seem right." Catherine followed her son's gaze but didn't immediately see what had caught his attention. The guard appeared to be in his usual position, rifle at his side, eyes fixed straight ahead. But George's young eyes were sharp, and he could see what the adults around him were missing. The guard's face was pale, much paler than it should have been on such a mild morning. Small beads of sweat were forming on his forehead, despite the cool breeze that swept across the courtyard. His breathing seemed labored, though he was trying desperately to maintain his composure and follow his training. George had learned from his father, Prince William, that being royal meant caring for people, especially those who served the family. His grandfather, King Charles, had often told him stories about the importance of noticing when someone needed help, even if they couldn't ask for it themselves. A small crowd of tourists had gathered nearby, taking photographs and chatting excitedly about seeing the famous guards up close. They pointed and whispered, completely unaware that one of the men they were admiring was struggling to remain standing. The guard's name was James Mitchell, though George didn't know this yet. James was 23 years old and had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 2 years. He had always taken pride in his duty, standing for hours without moving, protecting the royal family with unwavering dedication. But today was different. Today, James was fighting a battle that no one could see. He had woken up feeling unwell but had reported for duty anyway. The guard culture was one of absolute commitment, where showing weakness was discouraged and pushing through discomfort was expected. James had convinced himself that he could make it through his shift, that his training would carry him through whatever was making him feel so terrible. But as the morning progressed, James felt worse and worse. His vision was becoming blurry, his legs felt weak, and he was struggling to maintain the perfect posture that was required of every royal guard. The heavy bearskin hat, which usually felt manageable, now seemed to weigh a ton on his aching head. George continued to watch the guard with growing concern. His young mind might not have understood exactly what was wrong, but his heart told him that someone needed help. He had been taught that helping others was not just the right thing to do, but the royal thing to do. The princess noticed her son's continued focus on the guard and decided to observe more carefully herself. As she watched, she too began to see the signs that George had spotted. The guard's slight swaying was becoming more noticeable, and his complexion was definitely concerning. "You're very observant, George," Catherine said softly, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "I think you might be right about that guard." Just then, James felt the world around him begin to spin. He fought against the sensation, knowing that falling or showing weakness would be a serious breach of his duties. But his body was betraying him, and he could feel his strength ebbing away with each passing second. The tourists continued their chatter, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. Some were even making jokes about how the guards never moved, laughing about their stone-like expressions and unwavering discipline. George felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. These people didn't understand that the guards were real people with real feelings, not just tourist attractions. They were men and women who dedicated their lives to serving his family and the country, often at great personal cost. As James's condition worsened, his superior officers nearby remained focused on their own duties, trusting that each guard would maintain their post as trained. The system that had worked for generations was failing to account for the human element, the possibility that someone might need help but be unable to ask for it. George made a decision that would soon capture the attention of the entire world. He wasn't going to stand by and watch someone suffer in silence, even if it meant breaking protocol or drawing unwanted attention to himself. The 8-year-old prince took a deep breath, straightened his small shoulders, and prepared to do something that would define not just his character, but his understanding of what it truly meant to be royal. In that moment, Prince George was about to show the world that true nobility comes not from titles or crowns, but from the courage to help others when they need it most. Without hesitation, George broke away from his mother's side and walked directly toward the struggling guard. The tourists around them began to notice the young prince moving with purpose, their cameras quickly turning in his direction. But George wasn't thinking about cameras or headlines. His only concern was the man who clearly needed help. "Excuse me, sir," George said in his clear, polite voice as he approached James. "Are you feeling all right? You look like you might need to sit down." James was stunned. In all his training, no one had prepared him for a member of the royal family, directly addressing him during his duty, especially not with such genuine concern. He tried to respond while maintaining his position, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Your Highness, I'm fine, thank you," James managed to say, though his voice betrayed his words. Sweat was now clearly visible on his forehead, and his hands were trembling slightly as he gripped his rifle. George stepped closer, completely ignoring the growing crowd of onlookers who were now watching this unprecedented interaction with fascination. "My daddy taught me that it's brave to ask for help when you need it," the young prince said earnestly. "And I think you need help right now." Catherine had quickly caught up to her son, and she could see immediately that George's instincts had been correct. The guard was clearly unwell and struggling to maintain his duties. She knew that the rigid protocols of the royal guard often prevented them from seeking assistance, even when they desperately needed it. "What's your name?" George asked the guard, his voice filled with the kind of innocent concern that only a child could express so purely. "James Mitchell, Your Highness," the guard replied, his training automatically kicking in despite his deteriorating condition. "Well, James, I think you should sit down before you fall down," George said with the straightforward honesty that children are known for. "It's okay to not feel good sometimes. Even guards are allowed to be sick." The crowd around them had grown larger, with tourists and staff members alike stopping to witness this remarkable scene. Many were recording on their phones, capturing what would soon become a viral moment that would be shared around the world. James felt tears forming in his eyes, not from his physical discomfort, but from the unexpected kindness being shown to him by this young boy. He had been struggling alone, trying to maintain his composure and fulfill his duties, but here was Prince George treating him not as a ceremonial figure, but as a human being who mattered. I don't want to cause any trouble, Your Highness," James said, his voice shaking with both illness and emotion. "You're not causing trouble," George replied firmly. "You're sick, and sick people need to rest. That's what my mummy always tells me when I don't feel well." Catherine stepped forward, her maternal instincts and royal training combining to handle the situation with grace. "James, is it? Prince George is absolutely right. You need medical attention, and we're going to make sure you get it." She gestured to one of the nearby security officers, who immediately approached. The princess quickly explained the situation, and within moments medical personnel were being summoned to assist James. But George wasn't finished. As the adults began to organize help for the guard, the young prince did something that surprised everyone present. He removed his own small jacket and offered it to James. "Here," George said, holding out the jacket. "You're shivering. This might help until the doctor comes." James looked at the jacket with amazement. Here was a future king, offering his own clothing to a guard who was simply doing his job. The gesture was so pure, so devoid of any sense of superiority or distance, that it moved everyone watching to tears. "Your Highness, I couldn't possibly," James protested weakly. "Yes, you can," George insisted, his voice carrying a note of gentle authority that hinted at the leader he would one day become. "Friends help friends, and we're friends now, aren't we, James?" The word friends hit James like a thunderbolt. In all his time serving the royal family, he had never imagined that one of them would consider him a friend. He was trained to serve, to protect, to remain invisible and professional at all times. But here was Prince George, breaking down every barrier and treating him as an equal. As the medical team arrived and began to assess James's condition, George stayed close by, his small hand gently patting the guard's arm in comfort. The crowd watched in amazement as this 8-year-old boy demonstrated a level of compassion and leadership that many adults never achieve. The medics determined that James was suffering from severe dehydration and exhaustion, conditions that could have led to a dangerous collapse if left untreated. They began to prepare him for transport to receive proper medical care. "Will James be okay?" George asked the lead medic with genuine concern. "He'll be fine, Your Highness," the medic assured him. "Thanks to you noticing he was in trouble, we can help him before anything serious happened." George nodded solemnly, satisfied that his new friend would be taken care of. But he wasn't ready to let James leave without making sure he knew how much his service meant. "James," George called out as the medics prepared to escort the guard away. "Thank you for protecting my family every day. You're very brave, and I hope I can be as brave as you when I grow up." James felt overwhelmed by the young prince's words. Through his illness and exhaustion, he managed to stand as straight as he could and give George a proper salute. "It's been an honor serving you, Your Highness. Thank you for caring about me." As James was led away to receive medical treatment, George stood watching until he disappeared from view. The crowd around them had grown even larger, with people wiping tears from their eyes and speaking in hushed, amazed tones about what they had just witnessed. The news of Prince George's compassionate act spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Within hours, the videos captured by tourists were being shared across social media platforms around the world. The hashtag #TraunerPrinceGeorgeCares began trending globally as millions of people watched the young royal's genuine concern for a struggling guard. Back at Windsor Castle, George was completely unaware of the international sensation he had created. He spent the rest of the morning asking his mother repeatedly about James's condition, wanting to make sure his new friend was receiving proper care. "Can we visit him in the hospital, Mummy?" George asked as they sat down for lunch. "I want to make sure he's feeling better." Catherine smiled at her son's persistent concern. "We can certainly ask about his condition, darling. But hospital visits might need to wait until he's recovered a bit more." Meanwhile, at the local hospital where James was being treated, doctors were amazed by his rapid recovery once he received proper hydration and rest. But what struck them most was his constant mention of Prince George's kindness. "I can't believe he noticed I was struggling," James told the nurses. "He's just a little boy, but he saw what dozens of adults missed. And the way he talked to me like I was important, like I mattered as a person." Dr. Sarah Williams, who was treating James, had seen the viral videos on her phone during her break. "That young prince has a special gift," she told James. "Not everyone has the ability to see beyond themselves and truly notice when someone else is in need." The story had reached far beyond social media. News outlets around the world were covering the incident, with headlines praising Prince George's compassion and maturity. Royal commentators were calling it a defining moment that showed the future king's character. But the most touching responses were coming from ordinary people who had been moved by the young prince's actions. Veterans, healthcare workers, teachers, and service members from around the world were sharing their own stories of times when a simple act of kindness had made all the difference. Maria Santos, a nurse from Spain, tweeted, "This little prince reminds us that true leadership starts with caring about others. What a beautiful example for children everywhere." Thomas Mackenzie, a retired soldier from Canada, wrote, "I served for 30 years, and I can tell you that being noticed and valued as a human being means everything. Prince George gave that guard a gift more precious than gold." At Buckingham Palace, King Charles was briefed on the situation by his staff. When he heard the details of his grandson's actions, his eyes filled with pride. "That boy understands what it means to be royal," the king said to his private secretary. "It's not about the titles or the ceremonies. It's about using your position to lift others up." Prince William was equally moved when he heard the full story from Catherine that evening. "George has shown wisdom beyond his years," he told his wife. "He's learning that real power comes from how you treat people, especially those who serve you." The impact of George's actions was being felt within the Royal Guard itself. Commander Patricia Hughes, who oversaw the guard units, called an emergency meeting to address the incident and its implications. "What happened today highlights something we need to discuss," she told the assembled guards. Prince George, an 8-year-old child, noticed that one of our own was in distress when none of us did. We need to create better systems to support each other. The guards listened intently as their commander continued. There's no shame in needing help. There's no weakness in being human. We serve the royal family, but we also need to serve each other. Sergeant Major Robert Thompson, a 20-year veteran of the Guard, raised his hand. Ma'am, if I may, what that young prince did today reminded me why we serve. We're not just protecting buildings or ceremonies. We're serving people who genuinely care about us. The meeting resulted in new protocols being established for the Royal Guard, including regular check-ins on each member's well-being and clear procedures for seeking assistance when needed. They would later name these new guidelines the George Protocols in honor of the prince's compassionate intervention. Back at the hospital, James was feeling much better physically, but he was struggling emotionally with all the attention his story was receiving. Nurses told him that reporters were calling, wanting to interview him about his experience with Prince George. I don't need any interviews, James told Dr. Williams. Prince George didn't help me so I could be famous. He helped me because he's a good person who cares about others. Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right attitude, James. But you should know that your story is inspiring people all over the world. Sometimes the most powerful messages come from the simplest acts of kindness. That evening, as news programs around the world featured the story, children everywhere were asking their parents about Prince George and what he had done. The young prince had inadvertently started a global conversation about compassion, service, and the responsibility that comes with privilege. 8-year-old Emma Chen in San Francisco asked her mother, "Can I be like Prince George? Can I help people who are sad or sick?" Her mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, smiled through tears as she replied, "Of course you can, sweetheart. You don't need to be a prince or princess to be kind to others." Similar conversations were happening in homes, schools, and communities around the world. Teachers were using Prince George's example to talk about empathy and leadership with their students. Parents were explaining to their children that true nobility comes from how we treat others, especially those who serve us. The viral moment was becoming something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. It was becoming a teaching moment for humanity itself, showing that age, title, and status mean nothing when it comes to basic human decency and compassion. 3 days after the incident, James was released from the hospital with a clean bill of health. But what awaited him outside was something he never could have expected. A small crowd of well-wishers had gathered, holding signs that read, "Thank you for your service and get well soon." James, among the crowd, was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman who had served as a nurse during World War II. She approached James with tears in her eyes and a small bouquet of flowers. "Young man," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I wanted to thank you for your service, and to tell you how proud I am of that little prince. He reminded us all what true leadership looks like." James was overwhelmed by the unexpected show of support. "Thank you, ma'am, but I was just doing my job." "And Prince George was just being himself," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "But sometimes the most ordinary moments create the most extraordinary changes." Meanwhile, at Windsor Castle, George was growing increasingly frustrated that he couldn't visit James. He had drawn several get-well cards and had even convinced his younger sister, Princess Charlotte, to help him make a friendship bracelet for the guard. "Daddy, can't we just call him?" George asked Prince William during their evening walk around the castle grounds. "I want to make sure he knows we're thinking about him." William smiled at his son's persistence. "George, James is probably overwhelmed right now with all the attention your kindness has created. But I have an idea that might be even better than a phone call." The next morning, Prince William surprised George with an announcement. "Your grandfather, the king, has agreed to something very special. We're going to invite James to have tea with us at the castle once he's feeling completely better." George's face lit up with excitement. "Really? He can come here? Can we show him my room? And the horses?" "We'll see what James would like to do," William laughed. "But yes, we thought it would be nice to thank him properly for his service and to let you two continue your friendship." The invitation to tea at Windsor Castle was unprecedented. While guards occasionally received commendations and honors, a personal invitation to share a meal with the royal family was unheard of. When James received the call from the palace, he thought it was a prank. "Are you quite certain?" James asked the palace secretary 3 times. "Prince George really wants to have tea with me." "Absolutely certain," came the reply. His Royal Highness has been asking about you daily and is very eager to see that you're well. The tea was scheduled for the following week, giving James time to fully recover and giving the palace time to prepare for what they knew would be a significant media event. But both Prince George and James were thinking less about media attention and more about their budding friendship. As word of the upcoming tea spread, it generated even more international attention. Royal experts were calling it a modern fairy tale and praising the royal family for their authentic display of compassion and accessibility. However, not everyone was pleased with the attention. Some traditionalists argued that the royal family was breaking too many protocols and that such informal interactions could diminish the dignity of the monarchy. Lord Pemberton, a longtime royal advisor, expressed his concerns during a private meeting at the palace. Your Majesty, while Prince George's actions were certainly admirable, we must consider the precedent this sets. We cannot invite every guard to tea. King Charles listened patiently before responding. Lord Pemberton, this isn't about every guard. This is about recognizing an exceptional moment of human connection and teaching my grandson that his position comes with the responsibility to care for others. The king's response reflected a broader shift in royal thinking. The younger generation of royals, led by William and Catherine, were determined to make the monarchy more relatable and connected to ordinary people. As the day of the tea approached, James found himself nervous in a way he had never experienced during his guard duties. Standing perfectly still for hours while protecting the royal family seemed easy, compared to having a casual conversation with them. His fellow guards rallied around him, offering advice and support. Just be yourself, mate, said Corporal Davies, James's closest friend in the unit. That little prince likes you for who you are, not for any fancy manners. George, meanwhile, was making extensive preparations for his guest. He had chosen his favorite biscuits for the tea, selected books he wanted to show James, and even prepared a small tour of his favorite parts of the castle. What do you think James likes to do when he's not being a guard? George asked his mother as they reviewed the planned activities. I think he'll enjoy whatever you want to share with him, darling, Catherine replied. He'll probably be fascinated to see the castle from your perspective. The night before the tea, James received an unexpected visitor at his flat. Commander Hughes arrived with a small package and a message from the entire Royal Guard unit. The lads wanted you to have this, she said, handing him a beautifully crafted badge featuring the Guard's insignia. They've inscribed it with friendship and service to commemorate this special occasion. James examined the badge with wonder. I don't deserve all this attention, ma'am. James, Commander Hughes said seriously, what you experienced with Prince George is something special. You've reminded all of us why we serve and how we should treat each other. That deserves recognition. As James prepared for bed that night, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 1 week. A simple moment of illness had led to an extraordinary display of compassion that had touched millions of people around the world. He thought about Prince George's words. Friends help friends. It was such a simple concept, yet it had created ripples that were still spreading across the globe. Teachers were using their story in classrooms. Parents were discussing it with their children, and people everywhere were talking about the importance of noticing when others need help. James fell asleep wondering if he would be able to adequately express to Prince George how much his kindness had meant, not just to him personally, but to everyone who had witnessed it or heard about it. The morning of the tea arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the windows of Windsor Castle. George had been awake since dawn, too excited to sleep any longer. He had changed his clothes twice, wanting to look nice for his friend James, and had carefully arranged his drawings and the friendship bracelet on the table where they would have tea. Mummy, what time is James coming? George asked for the 10th time that morning as he paced around the morning room. In about an hour, sweetheart, Catherine replied patiently. Why don't you help me make sure everything is ready? Together, they arranged the tea service on the elegant table that had been specially set up in the castle's less formal morning room. George had specifically requested that they not use the grand state dining room, wanting the atmosphere to feel friendly rather than intimidating. At his modest flat across town, James was experiencing his own pre-meeting nerves. He had polished his shoes 3 times and was wearing his best civilian clothes, having been advised that his guard uniform wasn't necessary for this informal visit. His mother, Margaret Mitchell had driven down from Scotland to be with him on this special day. "I'm so proud of you, son," she said as she adjusted his tie. "Not just for today, but for the service you give every day." "Mom, what if I say something wrong?" James worried aloud. "What if I don't know how to act around them?" Margaret smiled and took her son's hands. "James, that little prince chose to help you because he saw your good heart. Just be the same good man you've always been." When James arrived at Windsor Castle, he was greeted not by formal palace staff, but by Prince William himself. The future king's casual manner immediately put James at ease. "James, it's wonderful to meet you properly," William said, extending his hand warmly. "George has been talking about you nonstop. I think he's more excited about this tea than he was about his last birthday party." As they walked through the castle corridors, William chatted easily with James about his recovery and his service with the Royal Guard. "You know, James, what you do every day matters more than you might realize. The dedication you and your colleagues show gives our family great comfort." When they entered the morning room, George immediately jumped up from his chair and ran to greet James. The young prince's face was beaming with genuine joy at seeing his friend again. "James, you look so much better," George exclaimed. "Are you feeling all well now? Did the doctors take good care of you?" "I'm feeling perfect, Your Highness, thank you," James replied, then caught himself. "I mean, George, you said we were friends, and friends use first names, right?" George nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Now come sit down. I made you something." The tea that followed was unlike anything the castle staff had ever witnessed. George showed James his drawings, including several pictures he had drawn of royal guards with big smiles on their faces. He presented the friendship bracelet that he and Charlotte had made, explaining each colored bead's significance. "The red one is for courage, like you have," George explained seriously. "The blue one is for friendship, and the yellow one is for happiness because you make me happy by being my friend." James felt his throat tighten with emotion as he accepted the bracelet. "This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received, George." "Thank you." But George wasn't finished with his surprises. "I also wanted to ask you something important," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone much older than his 8 years. "I want to learn how to be a good guard like you. Will you teach me?" James was stunned. "You want to learn guard duties?" "Not the standing still part," George clarified quickly. "I want to learn how to protect people and serve them the way you do. Daddy says that's what being royal really means." Prince William, who had been watching this exchange with growing pride, stepped forward. "George has been thinking about this a lot. James, he's realized that his future role is really about service, just like yours." What happened next would become one of the most touching moments ever captured in royal history. James stood up and gave George a proper military salute. "Your Highness," James said formally, "it would be my honor to teach you about service and protection, but I think you already understand the most important part." "What's that?" George asked curiously. "That the people you serve aren't just jobs or duties," James explained. "They're human beings who matter. You showed me that when you helped me, and that's the most important lesson any guard can learn." Catherine, who had been quietly observing from nearby, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son absorb James's words with the seriousness of someone much older. The conversation continued over tea and biscuits, with George asking dozens of questions about James's training, his duties, and his life outside the palace. James found himself relaxing completely, charmed by the prince's genuine curiosity and lack of pretension. "Do you have a family, James?" George asked between bites of chocolate biscuit. "I do," James replied. "My mom is here today, actually. She's waiting outside because she didn't want to intrude." George immediately turned to his father. "Daddy, can James's mom come have tea too? It's not fair for her to wait outside when we're having such a nice time." Within minutes, Margaret Mitchell found herself sitting in Windsor Castle, sharing tea with the royal family. The overwhelmed mother could barely speak at first, but George's easy chatter soon put her at ease. "Your son is a hero, Mrs. Mitchell," George told her earnestly. "He protects my family every day, and he's teaching me how to be brave like him." Margaret looked at her son with tears of pride streaming down her face. "He's always been special to me, Your Highness, but seeing him through your eyes makes me even prouder." The tea lasted much longer than originally planned, as genuine friendships were being formed around that table. When it finally came time for James and his mother to leave, George made one final request. "James, will you come back and visit me again? Not for anything special, just because we're friends." "I would love that, George," James replied. "And maybe next time you can show me more of the castle?" As they said their goodbyes, King Charles appeared, having heard about the wonderful afternoon from his staff. "James," the king said warmly, "thank you for teaching my grandson such valuable lessons about service and friendship." "Your Majesty, I think Prince George taught me more than I taught him," James replied honestly. The weeks following the tea party brought unexpected changes to both George's and James's lives. The story of their friendship had inspired similar acts of kindness around the world, creating what media outlets were calling the Prince George effect. Schools across Britain began implementing new programs focused on empathy and service. Children were encouraged to notice when their classmates needed help and to act with the same compassion Prince George had shown. Teachers reported remarkable improvements in classroom behavior and student relationships. At Lambrook School, where George was a student, his classmates initially peppered him with questions about his famous act of kindness. But George, with wisdom beyond his years, redirected their attention to the importance of helping others rather than seeking recognition for himself. "It wasn't about being famous," George explained to his friend Oliver during lunch. "James needed help and I could help him. That's what anyone should do." His teacher, Mrs. Rebecca Foster, was amazed by George's mature perspective. "Prince George has shown us all that leadership isn't about commanding others," she told the other faculty members. "It's about caring for them." Meanwhile, James had returned to his duties with the Royal Guard, but his experience had fundamentally changed how he approached his role. He became an advocate within the Guard for better support systems, and was eventually appointed to help train new recruits in both duty and personal well-being. Being a Guard isn't just about standing at attention, James would tell new recruits during their orientation. It's about being part of a family that looks out for each other. "Prince George taught me that we're all human beings first, Guard second." The George protocols that had been implemented in the Royal Guard were being studied by military and security organizations worldwide. The simple idea that checking on each other's well-being was as important as maintaining security was revolutionary in many traditional organizations. Commander Hughes received calls from Guard units in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all wanting to implement similar wellness programs. "A child taught us something that years of military training hadn't," she admitted during an international conference on military wellness. The friendship between George and James continued to grow stronger. They met regularly, sometimes at the castle and sometimes in less formal settings. James taught George about discipline, duty, and the importance of physical fitness, while George showed James the joy of seeing the world through curious, compassionate eyes. During one of their meetings, George had an idea that would further amplify their message of kindness. "James, what if we could help other people learn about being kind to each other, like how you taught me about being a good guard?" James was intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "Maybe we could visit schools or hospitals," George suggested excitedly. "Not as a prince and a guard, but as friends who want to show people that helping each other is important." The idea was presented to Prince William and Catherine, who were immediately supportive. They recognized that their son was developing a natural instinct for public service that went far beyond traditional royal duties. "George is learning that his platform comes with responsibility," William explained to palace advisors. "If he can inspire more kindness in the world, then we should support that." Their first joint visit was to a children's hospital in London. George and James arrived together, with George wearing simple clothes rather than formal attire. They spent the day talking with young patients about friendship, courage, and the importance of asking for help when needed. 8-year-old Sophie Williams, who was recovering from surgery, asked George why he had helped James. "Because everyone deserves to have someone notice when they're hurting," George replied simply. "And everyone deserves to have a friend," James added. "And George taught me that being helped doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." The children in the hospital were captivated by both the young prince and the guardsman. They saw in them proof that kindness could bridge any gap between people, regardless of their roles or positions in life. Dr. Patricia Adams, the hospital's chief pediatrician, observed the visit with amazement. "These children are learning lessons about empathy and human connection that will stay with them forever," she told the nursing staff. "It's remarkable what these two have accomplished together." The success of the hospital visit led to more invitations. Schools wanted George and James to speak about bullying prevention. Military bases requested their insights on supporting service members' mental health. Community organizations asked them to help launch kindness initiatives. But perhaps the most significant impact was happening in homes around the world. Parents were using the story of Prince George and James to teach their children about compassion, service, and the courage to help others. Maria Gonzalez, a mother of 3 in Mexico City, started what she called George Moments with her children. "Every day I ask my kids to tell me about someone they helped or someone who helped them," she explained in a viral social media post. Prince George showed us that kindness isn't about grand gestures. It's about noticing each other. The George Moments idea spread rapidly through social media, with families around the world sharing stories of small acts of kindness inspired by the young prince's example. International children's charities began reporting increased donations and volunteer applications, with many people citing Prince George's story as their inspiration. UNICEF created a new campaign called See Me, Help Me, that directly referenced the importance of noticing when others need assistance. As the global impact of their friendship became apparent, both George and James remained focused on the simple truth that had brought them together, that caring for others is the most important thing any person can do. "I never expected that helping James would teach so many people about kindness," George confided to his mother during their evening walk. "But I'm glad it did. Everyone should have friends who care about them." Catherine smiled at her son's words, recognizing that he was developing into exactly the kind of leader the world needed, one who led with his heart and never forgot that true power comes from lifting others up. 1 year after that fateful morning in the courtyard, Windsor Castle hosted a special ceremony that would forever change how acts of service and kindness were recognized within the royal household. King Charles had decided to establish the Prince George Medal for Compassionate Service, an award that would honor individuals who demonstrated exceptional care for others in their daily duties. James Mitchell was chosen as the first recipient, not just for his years of dedicated service as a royal guard, but for the grace and humility he had shown throughout the extraordinary events that followed his illness. The medal ceremony took place in the same courtyard where George had first noticed James struggling, creating a powerful full-circle moment. George, now 9 years old and even more confident in his understanding of leadership and service, stood beside his grandfather as the king presented the medal to James. The young prince had specifically requested to be part of the ceremony, and his parents had agreed that it was an important moment for him to witness. "James Mitchell," King Charles announced to the assembled crowd of guards, staff, and media, "you have shown us that true service comes not just from doing your duty, but from allowing others to see your humanity. Through your friendship with my grandson, you have taught the world valuable lessons about compassion, dignity, and the strength that comes from accepting help when it's needed." As James stepped forward to receive the medal, George couldn't help but remember that morning when his friend had been struggling to stand. Now James stood tall and proud, not because he was receiving recognition, but because he had become a symbol of something much larger than himself. "Your Majesty," James said as he accepted the medal, "this honor belongs not just to me but to Prince George, who taught me that the most important thing about serving others is remembering that we're all human beings who need each other." After the formal ceremony, George and James walked together through the castle gardens, a tradition they had maintained throughout their friendship. These walks had become precious moments where they could talk freely, away from the public attention that still followed their story. "James, do you ever think about that day when you were sick?" George asked, as they paused by the fountain where he often played. "Every day," James replied honestly, "but not because I was ill. I think about it because it was the day I learned what real friendship looks like. You changed my life, George. But more than that, you changed how I see the world." George nodded thoughtfully. "I learned something too. I learned that helping people isn't just the right thing to do. It's the thing that makes us who we really are." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of children from a local school who were visiting the castle as part of an educational program. When the children recognized Prince George, they became excited. But what happened next showed how much the young prince had grown in the past year. Instead of simply greeting the children and continuing his walk, George approached their teacher and asked if he could speak with them for a few minutes. With James by his side, he gathered the children in a circle on the garden lawn. "I want to tell you something important," George began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned profound lessons about life. "Everyone here is going to face times when they need help, and everyone here is going to meet people who need their help. The most important thing you can do is to notice each other and be brave enough to care." One little girl, about 6 years old, raised her hand. "Your Highness, how do you know when someone needs help?" George smiled and looked at James. "Sometimes, people can't ask for help, even when they really need it, so you have to watch carefully and listen with your heart. James taught me that it's always better to ask someone if they're okay, even if you're not sure, than to ignore them and find out later that they needed you." James added, "And children, it's important to know that needing help doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Prince George showed me that accepting kindness from others is just as important as giving it." The children listened with rapt attention, and their teacher later reported that the impromptu lesson had a lasting impact on the students' behavior toward each other throughout the school year. As the school group departed and George and James continued their walk, they reflected on how their story had grown beyond what either of them could have imagined. The Prince George effect had inspired the creation of kindness clubs in schools, support groups for service members, and community programs focused on checking in on neighbors and colleagues. Major corporations had begun implementing George protocols in their workplaces, creating systems for employees to support each other's well-being. Healthcare organizations were training staff to recognize not just physical symptoms, but signs that colleagues might be struggling emotionally or mentally. "You know what I think is the best part of everything that's happened?" George asked James as they sat on a bench overlooking the castle's rose garden. "What's that?" James replied. "That now lots of people have friends like we do," George said with satisfaction. "People who really see each other and care about each other." James nodded, thinking about all the letters they had received from around the world. Children writing to thank George for teaching them about kindness. Adults sharing stories of how they had been inspired to help others or ask for help themselves. Military personnel describing improved support systems in their units. As their walk came to an end, George and James made their way back toward the castle, where the afternoon's official duties awaited them both. George had lessons with his tutors, and James had to return to his guard duties. But their friendship had proven that formal roles and responsibilities never had to interfere with genuine human connection. "Same time next week?" George asked as they approached the castle entrance. "Wouldn't miss it," James replied with a smile. After all, friends help friends, and friends spend time together. As they parted ways, both carrying on with their respective duties, the impact of their friendship continued to ripple outward into the world. Schools were teaching empathy curricula inspired by their story. Military organizations were prioritizing mental health support. Families were having conversations about the importance of noticing when others need help. But perhaps most importantly, millions of people had learned from an 8-year-old prince and a dedicated guardsman that the most powerful force in the world isn't authority or wealth or position. It's the simple act of one human being caring enough about another to say, "I see you, and you matter." The story that began with a young prince noticing a struggling guard had become a global reminder that true leadership, real strength, and lasting change all begin with the same simple choice: to care about each other as human beings, regardless of the roles we play or the titles we carry. And in that choice, Prince George and James Mitchell had given the world a gift that would continue inspiring acts of kindness for generations to come.